Hi, I'm Eileen McGivney, and this is a paper I wrote with Bertrand Schneider. This is how I can fit barriers and facilitating factors to gender inclusion in makerspace education. So makerspaces are promising learning environments to increase women and girls' participation in STEM. So for this work, we were drawing on research from computer science education that shows that one reason for women's underrepresentation in computer science is the decontextualized ways that computing is taught, rather than women's motivation for computing with purpose. So maker spaces, because they blend digital skills, arts, and engineering, they provide multiple entry points into learning STEM skills and disciplines. So for example, someone who's interested in art or design, but may not necessarily be attracted to learning coding in a decontextualized way, will learn that by putting together projects within the makerspace. And so because of this, this has been shown as, makerspaces may have the potential to increase participation from groups like women and girls and other underrepresented minorities in STEM education. And it seems like universities are attaching onto this idea. University makerspaces aim to broaden participation outside of engineering. So a lot of these studios and spaces are being built on university campuses, not inside engineering departments, but in places like a graduate school of education, which is where our class takes place. Despite this, women remain underrepresented, excluded, and intimidated in makerspaces often. So women are underrepresented and they express feelings of exclusion. There's been a call to critically examine characteristics of makerspaces and their communities that marginalize some groups like women. And some of the reasons for this is that women may feel less confident in their abilities. There may be a devaluing of their expertise, and also how women see themselves in relation to making, such as the congruence of their own skills, identities, and motivations. These have all been identified as reasons, beyond something like just providing access to a makerspace to women, but reasons why women may feel uncomfortable, may not feel like they belong, and remain underrepresented. And so these are the types of things that we wanted to investigate in the context that we're working in. So our question was really, how can instructors better support and foster a sense of belonging for women in makerspace education environments? And so we were studying a class taught in a makerspace at the Graduate School of Education, which I will talk more about in a second. But we asked, what were these disciplinarily diverse women's motivations for learning in an education-focused makerspace course? And then what hindered or supported their learning and belonging in this context? Those were our research questions. The context is, as I mentioned, it's a course at the Graduate School of Education called Digital Fabrication and Making in Education. So it's meant to equip teachers and other students who are interested in implementing making in education or designing educational tools using digital fabrication. And the makerspace is located in the library. I'm actually going to show you what it looks like in a second. It has high and low tech equipment. And in the class, there were 22 students. 20 of them came from the Masters of Education program, 2 from the Graduate School of Design. There were 16 women and 8 men. So this is already a female-dominated space in a sense, and an unusual makerspace compared to a lot of other places. And these are pictures of all of our research participants' final projects. So for example, they were designing tools or toys or something for education within the makerspace. So in the top left is Emily's final project, which is a version of the game Pretty Pretty Princess that teaches children about circuits. And I actually am lucky enough that we have a 3-dimensional scan of the library. And so I can actually show you, give you a little walkthrough of the makerspace environment. So this is the 3rd floor of the library at the Graduate School of Education. And here on this side is the innovation studio, which is the makerspace. So we can actually walk in here and give you a little tour. So there are, as I mentioned, a lot of high-tech equipment, different types of printers up here. They're displaying students' projects. There's a sewing machine, laser cutters, again, different types of high-tech equipment, workspaces. And then there's also low-tech equipment. So for example, this is craft supplies that students can use in their projects. There are, lots of tools here for building things, woodworking, that kind of thing. And then there's a collaboration area here in the middle, and areas for the teaching team to provide instruction as well. So the whole class was taught in here, and hopefully that gives you a good sense of what the context looked like. So back to the slides. So the participants themselves, gender actually emerged as a focus for us. So I want to talk about that for a second. There were 6 women who participated in this interviewing study, which was part of a broader research project about the class itself. And gender emerged as a focus from the broader study, which was about personalizing instruction in makerspace learning environments. And the reason for this is that we were using a purposive sampling method to understand students' experiences of this personalized instruction. And so students were filling out survey measures every week about their satisfaction of the course, their personas, the receipt of personalized instruction from the teaching team. And what we found is that women held the extreme positive and negative responses in that first month, which was how we were trying to sample for the interviewing portion of this study. And so we became interested in looking at gender specifically to investigate why was it that women were having these kind of more extreme experiences. And so this isn't a representative sample, for that reason, but also because the course itself is, in a school of education, it has more women than men. This is kind of unusual for makerspaces. But we also think that it might illustrate the diversity that we expect to see in education-focused makerspace learning environments into the future. So as I mentioned, universities are building makerspaces in places outside of engineering departments. And so we actually think that these women's experiences may illustrate, some of the experiences we expect to find in the future as people from different disciplines and different backgrounds and identities start to work in these spaces. So the methods we used were qualitative interviews. They were semi-structured. They lasted approximately 30 minutes, and I conducted all of the interviews myself. The protocol was developed with the course teaching team, including with Bertrand Schneider, who was the professor. And it addressed different issues depending on the timing of the course. So in the beginning, the interviews asked for the students to describe their personas of learning in the makerspace. In the middle of the course, we asked more questions about the personalized interventions they were receiving from the teaching team. And then the final interviews were conducted after the course finished and asked about their learning trajectories and explicitly asked about their identities as well. And so there were 11 interviews total. Some of the women were interviewed twice, or some of them were interviewed 3 times. One was interviewed twice, and some of them were interviewed only 1 time each. And they were transcribed, and we coded them using a kind of iterative hybrid emic and EDIC thematic coding. And they were analyzed with the help of graduate student research assistants external to the teaching team and the broader research project. So I want to thank them. Delaney, Erica, and Jessica were a huge help on this, and we couldn't have done it without them. So I want to thank them for their assistance in analysis. Okay, so what did we find? So we did find that the makerspaces are a venue for STEM learning that allows for students diverse motivation, interests, and confidence levels. So this idea of makerspaces as a promising venue for bringing in a broader population and kind of, this computing with purpose idea, we did actually find evidence for that. So I want to talk a bit about each of the participants. Emily was motivated by adding new tools to her artistry. She identifies as an artist, a newbie, and also talked about herself as very feminine. Erin was motivated by understanding contextualized and playful learning and also her own learning process. She is a cognitive science. She described herself as rigid in the beginning, as a kind of planner and organizer, and also described herself as a woman of color. Lucy was motivated by being able to apply design and making skills to education contexts. She's a computer scientist. She also identified it as a collaborative learner, being an important identity for her. Maya is motivated by learning about makerspace education in low-income countries. She is a Pacific Islander. She also described herself as a kind of hard, fun learner. So she's motivated by challenge. Sarah was really motivated because she wanted a beginner level introduction to fabrication and felt that she couldn't find that other places. But throughout the course, realized that she actually also holds an interest in teaching and learning herself as well. And she described herself as a learning tourist. She's very interdisciplinary. And finally, Jessica was really motivated by working with and helping others to learn. So she identifies as a teacher at heart. She's a collaborative learner, and she's very creative as well. So we did find that, despite these really diverse motivations, the class was very impactful for students being able to learn things that they felt like maybe they couldn't learn otherwise. So Erin said, by the end of the course, I was taking more risks. I was trying new things, throwing out ideas. I did a lot of projects and activities that I thought I could never do at the beginning, which was really empowering for me. Similarly, Emily found that this was a way to become comfortable with STEM specifically. So I was way more comfortable in what STEM could be. I think that I didn't realize just how creative coding can be, how intertwined it could be with an eye for design and with the arts. It's way less intimidating now, and that's because of this class. So this kind of shows that for Emily, this idea that makerspaces and making is an entree into STEM for those with artistic skills or other passions and motivations, that this really does is a promising way. And she's somebody who felt that STEM was very much outside of her reach, something that she didn't have access to and did not have interest in learning prior to this. Lucy said the class has enabled me to pursue projects I find personally interesting. So she has a more of a technical background, but felt that if she'd taken a class like this about fabrication in a different environment, she couldn't have pursued the interest in education that she has. And Maya, who's a Pacific Islander, said, the way I see the makerspace often is within my own cultural context. I see the ocean as a lot like a makerspace, the terrain of possibilities, and I can go anywhere. So really this fit into how she approaches the world and her worldview, and the way of working in the makerspace really allowed her to explore those possibilities. But at the same time, we also found that there were barriers, and specifically that for some women, gender bias and sexism in the makerspace was a barrier to learning, but not for all women. So Emily, when asked if gender played a role in her learning, she said, not at all. Gender issues really didn't play a role. I felt like there was space for me, and I didn't think it mattered who was there. So she's an example of somebody who felt that STEM was very masculine before starting this class, but within this class environment gave her an opportunity to open up and learn and realize that it could align with her more feminine identity because of the way the class was organized. But at the same time, Erin was somebody who really did feel that sexism and gender bias played a role. She said, being a woman and being a woman of color, that's definitely something I thought a lot about in the space. The men were seen as somebody to refer to for questions, even though they didn't do an assignment or didn't really follow along in class. But for females, we had to kind of prove ourselves and actively answer questions, actively advocating for ourselves. So she said the assumption was always that the women wouldn't know how to code, or that they wouldn't have expertise in the technical side of things. And she also saw that the one female member of the teaching team was often kind of marginalized in discussions and things like that. So she really did see gender bias as an issue in this space. And I think that if even one woman felt that way, that's a problem, and highlighting it. So even though other women didn't necessarily bring this up. There was also an issue that there's misalignment between maker pedagogy and students' own ways of knowing and learning. That was a barrier for some of the students. And so specifically students who are more kind of used to a more structured learning environment. So Erin, who remember, she described herself as rigid and somebody who's an organized planner. She said the projects are very open-ended. They don't have specific times when we need this draft by. There aren't really any rubrics in this class, so I don't know how they're grading, so I'm struggling with that. So a lot of those ambiguities and lack of structure made it really hard for her in the beginning to focus on the skills and the projects. And Sarah also said, I almost wish there was more structure around, like a bit more sage on the stage. So she wanted a little bit more in direct instruction for, some of the concepts for her, especially related to education and learning, because that was an area she's not familiar with. And then also the women discussed a lack of community and collaboration that hindered their belonging and learning. So Jessica, especially, who really identifies as a collaborative learner and somebody who's motivated by helping others, said, honestly, I was more willing to help others in the beginning, but then there were a couple of instances where I felt like, why you got to act like that? Why you got to be so aggressive? You don't need to act like that. I guess it's more like disengagement from the class or from being in the space. And so she felt like the way the class was set up was not collaborative and there wasn't a strong community. And Erin also felt this was a barrier to bringing herself into her project. So we don't have that community yet. And do I want to share my personal experiences with the people in this class? I don't know yet. And so that kind of hindered her from really kind of exploring the projects as she wanted to. So to conclude, we find that supporting women in makerspace learning environments requires understanding their motivations and identities, and also providing support to combat sexism and bias specifically. So the broader project of research and also how the class was structured really focused on personalizing instruction based on students' feelings of competence and their preferences for things like independent or collaborative work, these kind of learning personas that they were capturing information about throughout the class. But these findings suggest that the students' motivations, their identities, their ways of thinking and learning are also really important factors in learning and belonging. And so instructors can also include measures of that or ways of getting to know their students' motivations and personalize their instruction based around these, other kind of more contextualized aspects of learning. And then finally, we also find that instructors can take steps to address sexism, such as including female teaching staff who maybe women may feel more comfortable bringing issues to, or also maybe less likely to exhibit some sexist behaviors. They can also provide opportunities to report sexism. So there was no anonymous reporting system that students could engage in. Every time they were asked to fill out surveys or something like that, their name was attached to it. And that may have been a barrier from raising these issues to the teaching team. And then also focusing on community building and belonging more generally. So, some of these women really felt like the community was lacking, and that got in the way of them feeling comfortable, feeling like themselves, and could indicate some of the issues in prior research of why women feel excluded or intimidated in these spaces as well. So that is the findings from our paper. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and comments in the live session on July 22nd. Thank you.